Hello. As a traumatic brain injury survivor, I thought it'd be fun to share my story in the hope of spreading a little Christmas cheer in this COVID-skewed year. But basically, I relished an excuse to wear my elf costume. The reason I've decided to tell this little story is to give it a little insight that positive outcomes can actually happen. If you're feeling in a terrible place right now, please don't give up hope. I'll tell you about my own recovery so far. Firstly, it's important to understand that the term recovery doesn't necessarily mean return to exactly how you were. You may have to accept that some things will be different. One thing I won't do is to sugarcoat your challenge ahead. Life might seem bleak right now and you genuinely can't imagine it getting better. Your recovery might take months or even years, but please don't give up on yourself. You will make it. So my incident and hospitalization. My name is David. I'm a 51-year-old retired IT security consultant from Stoke-on-Trent in England. In July 2015, at the age of 45, I suffered a severe head injury following a collision between my bicycle and a car being driven at 40 miles an hour. The impact resulted in large hematomas in my brain which required neurosurgery. In lay terms, blood was clotting dangerously in my brain. I was comatose for 4 weeks, the first 2 weeks of which were recorded as Glasgow Coma Scale 3, the most severe possible. When I eventually emerged from my coma, I exhibited locked-in syndrome symptoms for a week. All I was able to do was move my eyes. I couldn't speak, move my limbs, or even my head, but I could hear spoken words around me. Following improvements in my condition, I was moved to an NHS rehabilitation centre, where I spent a further 10 weeks of hospitalisation. I was encouraged to attempt basic tasks such as walking safely, making porridge, getting involved in conversation and quizzes with other patients, etc. This led to my hospital discharge. So 4 months on from my injury, I didn't need to rely upon hospital support and was generally well enough to be discharged home. In a blaze of blind optimism, I thought the biggest challenges were behind me. However, I spent the first few months at home doing little more than getting through each day, since my brain just didn't feel like my own anymore. I still find it impossible to describe how my brain felt at this time and explain my limitations in a coherent manner. Maybe you yourself can identify with the difficulty of describing your feelings in a meaningful way. Perhaps the simplest explanation you can give is you simply don't feel normal anymore. So my early recovery at home. This is the most detailed section of my chat, so I'm breaking it up into 5 chunks. Much of the following I would categorise as hopefully helpful advice, but given how TBI is such a personal experience, I wouldn't be so ignorant as to state that the advice is the best for you. However, what I can say with total conviction is that it worked for me. First, diaries. It was very important for me to make regular diary entries, not so much to record what I did, more so about how I felt. Friends would often tell me how much better I was getting as they were comparing me to my previously poorly state. I genuinely didn't notice the positive changes. It was only by having baseline diary notes to refer to that I could properly evaluate their encouraging comments. It could be said that my diary serves as a barometer for me. 2. Routines. Create daily routines. That way you're more likely to keep yourself occupied. My own routines included visiting my mum, walking to the shops, an afternoon sleep period, gentle indoor biking exercises, reading a book, and watching a film or TV series. I felt the latter was important to record as a specific task rather than as simply something to do. Coping strategies. I'll briefly talk about a few of my own post-injury deficiencies and the coping strategies which I developed to help me. Short-term memory is a critical one, which seems common for most brain injury folk. I make notes of things like a lunatic. As soon as anything I intend to do or think I'll need to remember comes to mind, I get it down on paper. Or to be truthful, I tap it into an app on my mobile phone. I'm passionate about the following statement. Don't ignore items which seem unimportant or try to convince yourself that you won't forget. You will. When I'd left my house to walk to my mother's home, I'd often get anxiety about having locked the front door. The outcome was my walking back all the way to check. It was impossible to ignore the feeling to need to do so. I was advised of a coping strategy of using my mobile phone to take a photo of my key when locking the door, so I tried it. After following this approach, whenever I had a slight pang of anxiety about the door being locked, I didn't need to look at the photo to check. The simple knowledge that I'd taken a photo was enough. There became no more pointless return journeys to check on the front door view. To summarise, coping strategies are ACE. Testing yourself. It's generally recognised that short-term memory testing is counterproductive. Please don't do it. However, I gained much satisfaction from validating that my long-term memory and cognitive function was still largely intact. I made a record of every family holiday I'd been on over the previous 20 years or so, and then made notes of everything I could remember about each of them. I concentrated on personal recollections rather than items such as visiting such and such. For further enjoyment, I would go through the notes with my family. It was interesting to see which recollections were and weren't shared, and then to learn of some of their own recollections. Another testing area I enjoyed was using quiz apps on my mobile phone or quiz sites. It didn't matter that the tests were at a beginner or intermediate level. It was simply satisfying to get the validation that my brain was still okay. Acceptance. Acceptance of a new life outlook is challenging for many people. I was fortunate that I had the mindset of being grateful that I still had my daughter and my life partner with me. Everything else was secondary to that. I didn't think I could attain professional employment again, drive a car, go on holiday, or take part in any of the multitude of normal undertakings in life. Regardless, I did recognise the importance of appreciating what I did have. My resolution was such that even though I didn't expect to make much of a recovery, I was determined not to be a burden to any of my loved ones. My volunteering. After 12 months of doing relatively little with myself, I recognised that I needed a new life purpose. Returning to my previous job seemed an unrealistic proposition, and daytime TV was far from stimulating. I became determined to look into voluntary sector opportunities. It's one of the most rewarding decisions of my life. One position I undertook was with the UK's Royal Voluntary Service in a befriending role, which essentially meant me sitting and chatting with an elderly person who was lonely. I say chatting, but for the most part it was listening. I found that simply offering an ear was enough to ease loneliness for some folk. Befriending was minimal effort by me, but extremely rewarding for both of us. Complementing my Royal Voluntary Service engagement was another role as an IT buddy, which involved helping the elderly or unskilled use the shared computers at my local library. This typically entails setting up email accounts, demonstrating the use of price comparison websites, and helping people to manage their energy utilities online, etc. However, it quickly became apparent that computing was only about 10% of what the role entailed. It was empathy which people seemed to need most, and my exposure to the Royal Voluntary Service had helped me enormously on that score. Although I'd started volunteering purely to give me a daily purpose rather than plotting a path back to work, the confidence and self-worth I developed through volunteering indirectly led me to resume my professional career. In July 2017, a full 2 years after my accident, I returned to employment as a freelance IT security consultant with the Met Police in London. I'd been away from professional work for 2 years, and although I was prepared for finding I'd lost most of my utility following 2 years of being out of the loop, I was amazed to find that my technical skills had hardly depleted at all. After resuming work, I continued for 2 further years as an IT professional. However, one of the consequences of my brain damage is the inability to retain any new technology skills I attempted to learn. My realisation came during a 3-day training course I undertook, where despite enjoying the learning experience, I found that by the end of each day I retained almost zero knowledge. The observation meant it was time for me to retire, which brings me to where I am now. My remaining limitations. To provide a little balance to my story, I shouldn't give the impression that everything is hunky-dory and I've recovered to exactly as I was pre-injury. I still have deficiencies as a consequence of my damaged brain, but have worked hard on strategies to cope with them. Like most people who've experienced a brain injury, I have dreadful short-term memory. It was measured as 5th percentile, which is classed as being in the special needs bracket. I no longer have a sense of smell. However, a while ago while out walking with my life partner, I thought I smelled dog excrement and mentioned this to her. She confirmed this was indeed the case. I was delighted. My taste sense is practically zero. I can best describe it as everything tastes of nothing, although I can observe the texture of food in my mouth. My touch sensation is hugely impaired. One example of this is my gathering of towels from outdoor clothesline, only to be told that they're still wet. Finally, I generally don't recognise feelings of pain in circumstances where I'm not visually aware of it. I have burns, bites, cuts and abrasions that have resulted in wounds appearing on my skin, and I've not been aware of how they happened. As a pain test, I once crushed my fingers with pliers. It definitely hurt, probably because I could see it happening. The pain circumstance sounds like it could be a positive outcome, but it's really not a healthy state to be in. I'm not describing these issues to garner sympathy, it's only because I find that most people think they're interesting. So it's over to you. I'm assuming that you've experienced a traumatic brain injury. Perhaps you're in a hospital ward pondering what your immediate future looks like. Or maybe you're beyond the hospital stage and have been discharged home and are thinking, what should I do next? I just feel so aimless. Either way, you are likely to be feeling challenged by the next phase of your recovery. Let's call it striving for normality. I've put together a bullet list of things I hope you will find useful. None of it is official clinical advice. It's simply a record of my observations on things that were helpful to me. 1. You're unlikely to recover to exactly as you were prior to your brain injury. Accept yourself. In the words of a friend I made during my recovery, things are still normal. It's simply a new normal. I used to love that statement, but confess an irritation at it being hijacked by the COVID-19 pandemic. Stop apologising to people who care about you. People around you recognise and accept your limitations. In the simplest of terms, they get it. When doctors suggest coping strategies, listen to them intently and be prepared to give them a try. 4. Sleep is as important to well-being as diet or exercise. Ignoring tiredness is counterproductive. 5. Set realistic, that means low, goals and expectations. Baby steps is the sensible approach. It's inevitable if you want to get better rapidly. That's most likely unrealistic. 6. Recovery is non-linear. In simple terms, that means not a straight line. You can have 3 good days followed by a rubbish day. It doesn't mean that you're back at square one. 7. You'll probably be a little different, but you will make it. Now it's time for me to get out of this Alf outfit and store it away for another year. Goodbye.